I'm here with Jamie Notter, friend from a long time in the association world. So that's kind of where we intersected. And Jamie's here to talk about his new book. Him and Maddie Grant, both friends, When Millennials Take Over, and this part I love, preparing for the ridiculously optimistic future of business. So Jamie, tell us, like, what's the big idea in this book?
Well, you're hitting on it with the subtitle. I have to admit to everyone that When Millennials Take Over is a bit of a trick as a title. It's a marketing ploy. Nothing wrong with marketing, because they don't get to take over. No one generation ever runs things. But what the book is really about is the future of business. That what the millennials are showing us right now is they're shining a light for us on where leadership and management is heading. And so we sort of looked in our research for the overlap between what millennials are talking about and the way they're approaching things, and the way really companies with ridiculously strong cultures are doing things and succeeding. And so that's where we found the nuggets for this.
So this whole notion of, so it is interesting because millennials are the dominant generation of the workplace. They've actually surpassed boomers like me. But you know, the idea that they're potentially right. Talk a little bit about why millennials and how this happened.
So here's the deal with every generation is all generations are shaped by what's happening around them when they come of age. That's what shaped the boomers, that's what shaped Gen X, that's why they're different. They grew up in different time periods. Pretty easy concept to understand. What we're not paying enough attention to, I think, is the power of some of the influences for the millennial generation, the way they line up with bigger changes in society. So obviously the millennials are shaped by the social internet. Like, that's one of the biggest, we all know that, right? We talk about that. But we're not really realizing the social internet is a huge revolution and shifting power from centralized institutions out to individuals. Individuals now have the power to do things. And so the millennials, you know, we sort of complain about them, old folks like you and me, that they're entitled or that they want too much when they get to work. They want this stuff because we gave it to them when they were 11 years old. When they were young, they accomplished things, they solved problems, they built businesses, they did things that we couldn't do at that age. And that transforms their approach and means that we need to look at leadership differently in organizations and be prepared to run things differently based on who we have in the workforce.
So it's funny because we have an idea we call the shift change, right? This whole big shift from the boomer to Gen X and millennials. And one of the things we talk about is in the leadership notion, we've moved from this idea of command and control to connect and collaborate. And it sounds like that's kind of, so tell us more about how is leadership shifting? Well, regardless of millennials, right?
Yeah.
How is leadership shifting?
The command and control piece, which is still going to exist to some extent, like that doesn't go away entirely. But like on hierarchy, which we assume has to be the sort of rigid organizational chart, that needs to become much more fluid. Like that's one of the capacities that we talk about in the book. You can still have a hierarchy. I don't think hierarchy goes away. But it needs to be more flexible. And the challenge there, this is what I find with every organization I work with. The challenge is figuring out, well then, on what basis are we going to make it flexible? How do I know when to give somebody the authority to decide and then somebody else not? Like that seems really hard. And that's because they haven't done the work of figuring out what drives the success of the enterprise, right? Like
I love that idea. So tell me a little bit about that. So your like kind of definition of culture, I really like how you frame that up.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people view culture as like, oh, it's a nice to have, like we want to make people happy and value, you know, collaboration and integrity and that kind of thing. And that drives me insane. Culture is really brass tacks. It's about what we value inside our organization, what's really valued, what gets attention, what gets resources. And then a strong culture is one that aligns that with what drives your success.
Now that's the big idea, right? So in other words, this whole notion, like a lot of people think, I'm tired of you telling me I have to give in to the millennials. I'm tired of, you know, doing that. Just, okay, we'll just give it lip service. That's what I see a lot of, so a lot of people like frame up their culture to act like that when in fact that's not true. So the reality though is this idea of what drives success and gives you a good culture. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
So for instance, like we'll do an assessment with an organization on their culture, and they'll see even along the continua that we present in the book around digital and clear and fluid and fast. They want to know their scores. Are we good at this? And they'll get a range, and they're maybe better at digital, but not so good at fluid or whatever it is. But what shocks them is that our next question is, so is this what you need to be or not? And a lot of them can't answer that. They're like, well, aren't I supposed to be fluid? You wrote about it in the book. I'm like, I think fluid in the big picture is where we're headed, but in your system, with your people and your market and your customers, why does fluid make a difference to what drives your success? And the ones that can answer that question start creating an amazing culture. And actually the organizations that we studied in the book, the case studies, they started from that place. Yeah. They all got really clear on what drives their success and said, wow, and they do different things. One's a healthcare company that's very fluid in their hierarchy. Another one has a fairly standard hierarchy, but they're really good on transparency. And in each case, it's because the leaders said, we're not going to succeed in what we do unless we do this. Yeah. And they built their culture around that. And so that's where culture becomes powerful and not just the feel-good, flavor of the day, posters on the wall stuff. It has to be, this is what makes us successful, and then this is the hard part. And so if you can't do that, we're going to fire you. Yeah. So there's a huge HR piece to this, which people don't realize, is that once you get clear in culture, you got to manage your people around that. Otherwise, you sort of go backwards.
So it's funny because this reminds me of, one of my kind of mentors in the old days was Tom Peters. Mm-hmm. And Peters' big aha when he wrote In Search of Excellence was hard is soft and the soft is hard. And what he was meaning is the hard stuff around business, right? The hard assets and the ROI and all that stuff, that's not really what counts. It was the soft stuff, right? The culture and the people and how you structure that, values and vision and those kind of things. And that's really, so this is kind of a renewal of that. And I guess what I'm hearing you say is that the millennials have kind of opened up that spotlight because that's all they know and that's the way they like to work. And so that's what they're demanding in the workplace.
Yes, and I also think it's a renewal of this, that concept, but I also think it's a refinement of it because I think we started 10, 15, 20 years ago saying, ooh, this soft stuff is important, but that led to the core values movement, which I have an attitude about, as you can tell. It's like, I love core values, but we spent so much time trying to look good. Right. And sound good.
Instead of living that.
And try to attract people based on how we appear. Yeah. And what's different, I think, with the millennial generation, and this goes to the social internet piece of it, it goes to the empowered generation that they are, they see much more.
Can't hide.
And they, like this, so we write about transparency, we write about clear in the book. And I remember interviewing a millennial for the book, and it's sort of, they were looking to me like I was the expert, like I know why organizations are the way they are. And because they want so they're like, hey, can you tell me something? I'm like, what? And they're like, why is it that the senior management team meets like all the time and never tells anybody what they're talking about? Like that, they just scratch their heads when they look at how we run things. Why are you not sharing more information? Why are you not empowering the people who are closest to the customer to take action? And again, a lot of companies are. Yeah. Right? So this is not new. Like this stuff, there's nothing new under the sun, folks. Like people have been doing this for a while, but we haven't, again, been shining the light on it like the millennials now are, because they're asking for it. And there's a lot of them, so that gets our attention.
All right, now in the book, you basically lay out these 4 things, right? Digital, clear, fluid, and fast. Yes. Is that the right sequence?
Yep.
Whoa. So give us the kind of thumbnail about what's important about each one of those.
Right, so digital is maybe obviously about digital technology, but less obviously and maybe more importantly about what we call the digital mindset, which is really focusing on the user, which can include your customer obviously, but also your employees, designing organizations around the needs of employees, making it a customizable experience, that's digital, making it constantly innovated and improved, that's digital. So we need to basically apply those techniques and those approaches to management and leadership. Right. What if we were constantly innovating leadership? I don't see that happening in organizations, and we need to. Clear is about transparency, but not transparency for transparency's sake. It's more strategic. It's specifically about making things visible in order to increase the quality of decisions that get made. right? Like it's like
Right.
this need to know basis, like I'll only distribute it if you need to know. I can't know if you need to know.
Right.
So I need to make everything visible so that people can take action when they need to. That's clear. Fluid, as we talked about a little bit, is about hierarchy and making it more flexible. And that's specifically around knowing what drives your success and then using that to define when to bend from the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Hierarchy will exist. We need it to help simplify
Always.
world, but we need it to be flexible at certain times.
Yeah.
And it needs a principle to guide you, and that's what drives your success, and that's what's, again, missing. And then, so that one's harder. That's why we do list it in this order. And then fast is the last one. Obviously, every organization wants to be fast, but we're talking about like leap ahead kind of speed.
Yeah.
And this one's a little depressing for old school leaders. In order to get speed, you have to give up control.
Yep.
And no one's going to give up control just because I told them to. So in order to give up control, you have to figure out what can I trust in its place. And so building a trust system inside your organization, that's what's going to free up the resources to say, all right, I will give up control knowing I can trust X.
Yeah.
And then again, this is where it gets back to culture. The only way I can create a system where I know I can trust X is if I hire for X, and if I fire people who don't do X. I got to have that capacity be central to the culture in order to achieve this kind of speed that we're looking at. And again, I love the fact that our case study for FAST is a bank. Okay, we chose case studies to prove to people that even if you think, oh, well, banks can't be fast, they're regulated, and but we got them in there. We got a healthcare company being fluid. We got a small nonprofit being digital. Like this is accessible to anyone if you're true to the principles.
So, what advice would you give people? Like, where would I start? If I have no idea what I'm, how do we even begin to think about this?
So, for me, the biggest place to start is getting clear on what your culture actually is.
Instead of the culture by default, which most organizations have.
Most organizations, they can't even name their culture.
Right.
But I think when they say, oh, we need to start naming it, and so they ask the boss, what's our culture? And the senior management team starts defining their culture, which then therefore has to sound good. And suddenly the marketing department is now defining your culture. And we're writing our core values, and we move into this, let's talk about how awesome we are.
Yeah.
And there's not the, let's be honest about where we are. Yeah. And that conversation, you can have those conversations, but you have to drill down to the level of, we say we're about collaboration, but let's get clear.
Are we really?
We collaborate when it's about this, and we don't collaborate when it's about that. And why is that? Because when you can define that, then describe that to people, and then have everyone in your organization go, oh, yeah, that's how we are. Now you're onto something.
Yeah.
And that starting from what is piece is really missing, because that's when you say, you know what, we're not very clear. Like, we are pretty private. We are careful with the information we share, and we're intentional about that,
right.
And we're careful with it. And because of our environment and our market, that's how we should be,
right.
And that's fine. So you choose to change, you choose to move in any direction around digital, clear, fluid, and fast, not because we said these are all good, but because you made that connection. This is who we are at a really deep level, and it's who we need to be.
Yeah.
Or it's not who we need to be, and here's how we need to change. But it all starts from knowing what is.
So one of the things we're hearing a lot, and from my colleagues in the association world as well as in the commercial world, but this whole disruption that's happening to everyone's business models, which is creating this urgency to say what's next. And it sounds like a lot of your principles would help guide you in terms of how you think about that change. But you have to start with, I think you're right, where are we? And maybe more importantly, what is the business we are choosing to be in? Mm-hmm. And what's that going to mean going forward? And so interesting, a lot of the stuff that we've been looking at is there is no more long-term competitive advantage per se in a business, because you're going to have constant, so we think you're going to have to be constantly nimble and fast and pivoting, right?
Right.
How does that fit into what you got, you've thought about in some of the research you're saying?
I'm agreeing, basically, and obviously fluid and fast are consistent with that. And although I do make the point that you get to choose what your culture is based on what drives success, big picture wise,
those are going to be.
If you're not at least working on fluid and fast, I think you should. So we need to be moving in that direction. But it's even so. Like I worked with an organization that is very high touch customer service, because their customers are in an industry that does the same thing. Okay, so they are expecting that from this group, and that means they are choosing to go slower, because high touch is going to matter. Because it's long term, it's a community, it's a lifelong relationship. And that they are really clear on that drives success. And so they are choosing to basically not be as responsive. Like in a not responsive like it's a high touch obviously, but not like we need to be constantly doing everything you need. No, we are high touch first, and so that means we choose not to do other things. And so to me, that's a kind of a business model disruption piece, which is we are choosing to not go with the flow. Everyone thinks the business model is going in this way, and we're strategically saying, you know what, we're going to be the only ones left standing on this side.
And that's what
they're going to come back to. And it's a bet, but that's what we do in business, right? Is figure these things out. But the epiphany for them was the realization that matters more. And the realization that, in fact, the systems they had in place in their organization made it impossible to be high touch. Because of a previous leader, because of this sort of history that they had a culture that they had inherited unintentionally that kept them from delivering that. And so changing their culture was more about changing some of the systems and processes they have that were keeping them from achieving that results in that high touch piece. And again, that's the awareness that drives this, right? Like everyone's business model is going to be disrupted. The ones that are hyper aware of who they are going to respond.
And you'll be able to pivot a lot easier because you'll be able to know what's important and what you can find as you go along that journey. It's interesting because we've been on a kind of a 3-year journey to transform what we're doing based on disruption we've seen in the continuing ed market. And one of the big things, so the whole digital part, we're moving our entire infrastructure. So it's interesting because your high touch thing would explain CPAs professions, high touch. And we're trying to do an and there. So we're trying to, it's funny, one of our board members at the last board meeting actually said this. We said our new systems that'll be rolled out here in about a week are meant to be as frictionless as possible. We want to be easy for members to do business, find what they need, get what they have to do. And then he said, but you also want to be able to have time for high friction. So it's interesting because the event you were at with us was one of those high friction events where you want high impact engagement, people get to really interact with you. So that's the beauty, right? You can make it easy to get all the other things you need, but by the way, we're going to have those high touch. So we're actually trying to balance those two, interestingly enough, from that perspective. But that's how I'm looking at it. I mean, I think you're going to need to move on all 4 of those points, whether you like it or not, at some point. But you're right. You got to choose where you are and how fast you can move. So what about that? What if you found out you were like really low, and you think you really need to be high? What's any advice from that standpoint?
So when you get clear on a piece of your culture, which is basically, I've got a system where we value certain things that generates behaviors that don't produce results. Like that's the problem. You're like, all right, we need to shift this. We need to, for instance, I had one client that was really good at part of innovation, which was creativity, permission to hack, like really that kind of thing, but they were very bad at taking risks and testing new ideas, okay, which seems sort of contradictory, but in fact, that's where their culture came from, is the previous leader would slap you on the hand if you tried anything new. And so they learned to be creative and hack things because nothing ever changed. And so that's the only way they could make it, right? So they had this capacity here, but they lacked it up there. So you realize that you then need to change processes. I mean, I do think there's an article in Harvard Business Review that says culture is not the culprit. You know, that you don't change your culture, you just change your business processes and your culture changes. And I'm like, well, kind of. But there is that piece that if you just change the way you do things, you are making it clear, we value this. We used to value that, now we value this. So even on testing new ideas, like for this particular client, I was going to recommend to them, like, hey, run a contest internally and have people develop an experiment plan. What's our hypothesis that we're going to test? How are we going to test it? When will we see the results? Can we get something that will show results within 2 months? And then have them submit it at a day and have them a panel vote on it or something, whatever. Make it fun.
Like an Ignite session, right?
And then get some ideas to test it and like just build that capacity, build that habit, build a process that supports the culture change you want. And I think there's 2 levels of processes that you'll work on. One we call making it real, which is something immediate and visible, so people get that it's not just the management flavor of the day. And then making it permanent, which is really changing infrastructure, a lot of HR change. The only way you're going to change culture is if HR is on board with that, and all of your HR processes and systems are aligned towards the new culture.
Because I mean, a really tight culture, people know when they belong and they know when they don't belong. And so it begins to become a self-sustaining or self-weeding out process in some cases. I want to I think I want to close with, you have another big idea around the changeover in leadership from the old mechanistic industrial age era, which most of us boomers grew up in, to this new humanistic phase. Tell me a little bit about that. And then I want to tie in and close with your other book called Humanize, that really laid the groundwork for this stuff.
Yeah. So we identified in this book that there's a pretty interesting pattern that happens with generations that goes back several centuries, that every 4 generations there's a huge transition. And the last transition was turn of the 20th century into World War II. That was industrialization, sort of the modern era. And that happens to be when management was invented. Okay, so management was invented with this industrial machine and engineering mindset. So we design our organizations in the abstract, and then we expect them to work repeatedly like a machine does. And,
scale it.
And that's been great. We've done amazing things in the last 100 years, but we always tried to cram in our human beings into those systems in kind of awkward and uncomfortable ways. And that's, to me, why we consistently have low employee engagement, even though we know we've had this problem for 10 years. We've not moved the needle because we haven't changed the fundamental operating system. The operating system puts engineering first and human community second.
Cog in the machine.
And so this model, I think, that the millennials are pointing to is not hugely different in that it still involves engineering, it still involves scale, it still involves machines and mechanical thinking. That's all good. There's nothing wrong with that. But it flips and puts humanness and human community at the center. And when you do that, suddenly, and then you put your engineering around that. So you still have the engineering value, but when you put the human community in the middle, you get the power that was like unleashed by the internet. Like that's the power that's unleashed by the internet is because we gave people the power to express and be themselves as human beings. And once we unlocked that potential, you saw what could happen. Revolutions happened because of
Arab
that.
Spring, right?
And so this notion is that like this is happening. And so our opportunity is just sort of to unlock it. All you have to do is open the door and this stuff comes out. But it requires a different format and a different, like the letting go of control piece. Like that's going to be hard for managers. They're like, oh, well, what if we let go of control and it gets messy and it takes longer? And I'm like, then create some boundaries around it, run an experiment, and I'll show you the results.
And the other thing is you're always in beta, right? You have to keep tweaking it. But isn't it a lot more fun? I mean, the whole idea of focusing on the people first, and that includes your customers and your folks in your companies, but it's more fun. So it makes work fun again, and that whole engagement notion, I keep saying that's like untapped energy that we all have in our organization, that 70%, if that was 30%, you've now flipped your whole model of how much work you're gonna get done, how much happier your employees and your customers are gonna be, and it's right, that's incredible.
It's incredible and a huge opportunity, and what frustrates me is that our response to that has been to run engagement surveys. And then measure our engagement and go, ooh, this is not good. And they're like, well, they ask questions like, ooh, do you have the resources you need? And everyone's like, no. And they're like, let's give them more resources. And then they run the survey again, and the scores either don't change or don't change much because they haven't. And they're like, oh, but I gave you more resources. Like, we are asking the wrong questions. We are not asking the questions that says, what is it really like to work there? And then, does that drive our success or not?
I love that.
When you align those two things and people see that the way they do their work, A, makes sense to them because they like this culture, otherwise they'd leave, and B, drives success and generates results for everybody, like that's where engagement happens. But engagement is the result.
Yeah.
It is not the lever you pull.
Right.
And the lever
You can't just magically wave your wand and go, you're now engaged.
No, the lever you pull is this
culture.
aligned culture. And that's what has been exciting with what we've been doing in organizations. And we have this survey called the Workplace Genome Assessment. That is, it's based actually on a combination of when millennials take over and humanize. Those principles we wrapped into basically a 64-question survey that says these are the 64 building blocks of culture. They're going to combine differently.
Right.
We're all unique.
That's the
but
DNA
we're based
part.
on the same
Genome,
code,
yeah.
but it's all combined in different ways. And so you will get a picture of how yours is combined. You make that assessment about whether it's what's going to work or not,
Right.
and then run from there. Like that's taking the engagement piece out of it.
Right.
And then magically you get the results on the other end.
Yeah.
And that's what's exciting, because I think we are not, we're so focused on pulling that engagement lever that we're missing opportunities to build strong cultures.
Yeah. All right, how about if you could sum up on a 3x5 card for people, like what's the takeaway that they should be thinking about from this conversation? What would you say?
I would say culture is going to matter more than it used to, particularly for the millennials. They are the largest generation ever, and they consistently say that they care more about culture.
Yeah.
So that's moving from a nice to have to a must have.
Yeah.
And then the piece that we've talked about a lot is that the only thing that makes your culture good is if it drives success. And aligning those two things is where the power comes, and it's not about copying Zappos or Google or Tom Hood or anybody. Like, it's not the point.
It's gotta be what.
The point is understanding what drives your success and then creating a system that values that and moving the right people in and the right people out to make sure that happens.
So, Jamie, as we think about this, and I'm talking to a bunch of firms, half our membership's in public accounting, professional services, all run by boomers, struggling with all of this sea change, right? Because they're very hierarchical pyramid organizations. What kind of advice do you have for them, and have you worked with any? I know, in fact, one of your partners, I think, is a CPA, right? So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think this is actually one of the reasons why we generated this genome survey, is to give some data for folks to respond to. I think that even in a hierarchical organization, this goes back to the what drives success piece, we wanted to create a vehicle for people to say, here's who we are hierarchical in this way, and then to be able to explain why. Because I think if you can explain
So back to
why,
how does it drive success, I think, which is the key point I got from
if
you.
you can explain why, then you have a chance of retaining millennials that may not understand that hierarchical approach. Because if you can say, well, this is how it works and this is how it supports you. Like another example we talk about in the book, there's a book by Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, called The Alliance. Yeah. And instead of this, well, I'm going to hire you forever, maybe, and you're going to work for me forever, maybe, and no one ever tells the truth about it, how about we hire you based on a tour of duty?
Right.
Say, here's what you're going to get. Here's the freedom you're going to have. Here's the freedom you're not going to have. But here's what you're going to learn. Here's what you're going to get. Here's what you're going to give to us. Yep. After 2 years, you might want to re-up and do another tour. And that tour is going to be designed in a different way. And he takes that philosophy and says, partners should be having tours. Yeah. They should be writing up their tour of duty as a partner. Yeah. It may be a 20-year tour for all I know, and that's fine. Right. But define it. What are you getting out of this? What are you giving? What are you getting? What's the company giving? What's the company getting? Yeah. And being really clear on that, which means you do not have to give up your core structure, right? Which works for you from a business model point of view, I'm assuming, because they would have given it up by now, right. and to not apologize about it and say, you know what, like we're traditional in this way.
This is how it works.
Because it works for us, and we're willing to be flexible in these ways. There's probably a lot of ways where you could also say, okay, we're going to maintain this structure, but down here within this team, we're going to run that differently. Somebody today was said, you know what, we have these, we're calling them empowerment teams. They said, those guys, they have different rules, but they have boundaries around them, right? Like if you're gonna I say if you're going to punch holes in the boat, do it above the waterline,
I love
right?
that
Like
quote.
so, like run experiments, but create little teams down here that say, you know what, here you're not going to have to ask the same permissions that you have to ask. We actually worked with an association to create a collaborative work team across departments,
Yep.
and which has been successful. But one of the things they realized when they got down at that level is that because every department was represented, suddenly they didn't have to ask anybody's permission because they knew it was all going back.
Right.
And so they started taking action right, left and right.
That's neat.
And they said, this is the best part of this team is that we get to do things without having to ask for it first because everyone knows.
Everybody's represented in the room.
And that was such an epiphany for them that they realized that. So they didn't design that team with that in mind.
Yeah.
But when they got clear on that, that's when you say, oof, that's the piece of the culture that I need to develop then.
Yep.
And so they still have, they actually have they have really rigid silos that for legal reasons have to be kept separate. You can't have people over here know what's going on over here, antitrust stuff, right? So they have to have that, but they still manage to maintain that line and then let stuff go over this line up here.
Yeah.
And that has been huge, and that's the kind of clarity you can apply in basically any size organization and any structure organization.
All right, now how about, so, the other thing is when I talk to a lot of my CPAs, they'll say, well, this culture stuff is like for, GE and Zappos and all those kind of guys. What about that, 10-person firm or so that's around here?
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that the large companies come to me and say, well, yeah, this stuff is fine for the little 20-person staff, but what, how am I going to apply it? I will say that all 4 of our case studies in the book, I think, are under 1,000 people, and 2 of them are under 100. I think actually small companies have the advantage
Because they can move faster.
and you can get people in the room to get the perspectives there to get that clarity.
Right.
Whereas a larger system, you have to, you can still do it, but you have to build in other systems to get the data in, sort of a workforce intelligence challenge there with larger systems. But the other piece to mention is that the employees all say, well, this sounds great, Jamie, I'm supportive, but the bosses will never do it. Literally, when I talk to the bosses, they're like, well, look, I get it, Jamie, but there's no way the employees would go with this. I've literally seen organizations have both sides say the exact same thing. And so I think there's a huge opportunity wherever you are. I look at the small organizations, again, I think they have the advantage because they can move faster. But I look at organizations actually like GE that is applying the lean startup methodology to which is like a software company startup approach.
Right.
They're applying that to like a diesel engine production line.
Yeah.
And being successful at it. Like that's where you throw away your strategic plan and you are constantly iterating and you are constantly measuring and learning based on validation from your market or whatever your stakeholder group is at a huge company level. And so I'm at the point now where I don't tolerate the excuses. The excuses that we're too small, too big,
right, doesn't apply.
Too traditional, too new, too young, too old. I've seen it all. And I've seen them all break the mold. That's why our case studies are the way they are. They prove to you that just because you're one way doesn't mean
it has to be.
It has to be that way.
That's encouraging. So the other thing is back to this whole idea of engagement, because that's showing up everywhere. We're starting to see it in our profession pretty significantly in terms of one of the top challenges. So people are noticing it, I guess. We've talked about our own kind of transformation. So it's interesting. We went on a digital journey. We knew we had to get nimble. We decided to go all mobile, change our whole platform for customer frictionless, mobile first. We moved our space, took down our walls, went to an open collaborative. So it's interesting because those moves, I think, would be back to your making it real and visible. And they started to shape the behaviors that we wanted to. And then you're right, then we have to continue shaping those. Our latest tool that we found, so 2. One is Slack. Oh my God, that's probably the best thing we've ever done, right? Eliminated probably 80% of our internal emails. Talk about transparency, right? You pretty much can dip in and see everything going on inside your company at one time. And then now they've added on a engagement system, Office Vibe, which is like Disney, Apple, a lot of those guys use, but it's one of those cloud inexpensive deals. And what it does is it measures the 10 pillars of employee engagement, but it does it in a constant, fun gamification way. So it's like little questions that pop up in Slack, and so we've had, I guess we've been on it probably about 6 months or so. And it's just fascinating to see the feedback. So you get real-time feedback because your people can put in anonymous comments and I like this about what we do, I don't like that. So it really does give you this kind of constant pulse as opposed to the episodic employee engagement survey, which you know, and it measures, so like right now, I think our weakest score is in wellness, which is up to our employees. So we create a culture team to start making, but people were actually saying, I don't feel like I'm very healthy. So, you know, so that's not necessarily our job, but it can be part of the culture, right?
If you want it to be. When you're focused on the user,
yeah,
digital
exactly.
mindset.
So now we've got a walking group in our culture club. So so there's the neat thing about where all this is going, which was probably created by millennials, I'm sure, is that this kind of stuff is emerging really fast to give us even more tools to keep moving the culture forward, right?
Yeah, no, well, because we talk obviously about clear and transparency actually dates back to the Humanize book. We wrote a lot about it there as well. But in Humanize, we use the phrase to create a transparency architecture.
Yeah.
And you know, so the company that Maddie and I have is called WorkXO, and our partner Charlie is the CPA. He's in Chicago and Maddie and I are in DC. And we literally had to implement Slack to create a transparency architecture. And one of our channels is called TCB, Taking Care of Business.
Yeah.
And we literally, and then Maddie is smart at this, she created a bot that will remind us, hey, what'd you work on today? And we literally just say what we worked on that day.
Nice.
And that, for the three of us, creates a transparency architecture. So suddenly I'm knowing when to ask Charlie something, or I'm knowing what he's working on, so I'm not going to bother him about that right now. Whereas we would have had that inefficiency. Even with just 3 people, we can do that. And so the tools today, I mean, people ask me about performance reviews and how do we do better performance reviews? I'm like, leverage technology. Yeah. There's so much technology for workforce intelligence.
Right.
For gathering pulse surveys. Even the survey companies are doing this now.
Yeah.
They build in automated pulse questions if you want to even attach that to your annual surveys. Like even that's a step up.
Yeah.
In addition to what you're talking about.
It's available for small businesses as well as giant businesses, right?
Where no, it's not.
Literally on a subscription model that's next to nothing.
Yep. And we need to be doing this. I guess my not warning about this, but advice on this is then be disciplined about designing your transparency architecture and about designing the questions and designing the data that you're gathering with your clear culture in mind.
Correct.
Because if that's misaligned,
you're just throwing out a bunch of stuff and not doing anything about it.
You get distracted, you know, and you'll not know when. Because honestly, that health thing, even that could come up, and you could choose legitimately to say, I get that. That shouldn't be our focus right now.
Right.
Like, it's not that I don't support you being healthy, but I don't think we as a culture should go on that path. And if you had a clear answer as to why, you could make that case. Without that case, you're like, ooh, we need to put everyone on a diet. Like you can end up spinning wheels without realizing.
If you're not clear on what your intention is and how it relates to your success, I think that was the big aha for me as we've talked through some of this stuff. Well, this has been great. Jamie, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.